I have buried friends I knew for 30 years, and felt less than I felt for a man I knew for 9 days. That sentence has sat in my journal for the better part of my life now, and every time I open the book to add something new, my eyes drag back to it like a tongue to a missing tooth. 9 days. That was all the time the Lord, or the wolves, or plain dumb chance gave the two of us. 9 days between the night the pack came down off the ridge, and the morning the men from town rode up my draw with rope and rifles, and that particular brand of certainty I have learned to fear more than any animal. If you've come here expecting a clean story about a brave white rancher and a noble savage who learned to be friends, turn back now. This isn't that. I wasn't brave. He wasn't noble in the way the dime novels mean it. We were two frightened, bleeding men who happened to need each other for exactly as long as it took, and then the world we both belonged to decided that wasn't allowed. I'm an old man writing this by a lamp that's nearly out of oil. My hand shakes. But I'm going to tell you what happened up on the Shenega bench in the spring of 1884, and I'm going to tell it true, because there's nobody left who knew either of us, and a thing that isn't written down might as well never have breathed. So pour yourself something, sit close to the fire, and let me tell you about the wolves. The screaming is what I remember first, before anything else, before I could even have told you what was screaming or why. It came up the draw on a wind that smelled of wet juniper and old snow, a high tearing sound that I mistook, in the half-second before my whole body went cold, for a woman. I was 3 days into chasing strays that had drifted off the winter range, camped rough under a granite overhang with my horse hobbled, and a fire I'd let die down to coals because I was too tired to feed it. I'd been dreaming about my wife. Sarah had been gone 4 years by then, and I still dreamed about her in a way that left my chest sore in the mornings. And the screaming came right up out of that dream, and stood me on my feet with my heart going like a trip hammer. I am not a young man even now, and I was not a young man then. I want that understood. When I tell you I went toward the sound instead of away from it, don't go thinking it was courage. It was the dream. It was a fool old widower who heard something that sounded like a woman in the dark and would not, stand there warming his hands while it died. My quirk, and I'll own it since you'll notice anyway, is that I write everything down. Always have. My father called it a womanish habit and beat me for it once when I was 9, and I went right on doing it, which should tell you most of what you need to know about how I'm built. I had my little oilcloth journal in my coat pocket that night the way I had it every night, and the next morning, with my hands barely working, I wrote, "Came down on a killing. Pack of lobos, 6 maybe 7. A man already on the ground. Did not think. Should write that I thought, but I did not. The man on the ground was an Apache. I didn't know it in the moment. In the moment he was just a shape thrashing in the snowmelt, and the wolves were the realest things in the world, gray and low and silent now that they had their teeth in something, which was somehow worse than the screaming. One of them had him by the calf and was hauling backward with its haunches dug in, and 2 more circled with that terrible patience they have, that mathematical patience, waiting for the moment the prey's arms got tired. I had my Winchester. I want to say I aimed. I didn't aim. I worked the lever and fired into the dark at the gray that moved, and I think I hit a rock the first time because the second shot is the one a wolf yelped at, and the yelp was so human and so hurt that I felt sick even as I levered another round. The pack scattered the way smoke scatters, there and then simply gone, no transition, the dark just folding back over the place they'd been. One stayed. The big one, the one with the man's leg. It turned its head and looked at me, and I have shot a great many animals in my life, and I will tell you that nothing has ever looked at me the way that wolf looked at me, like I was a thing it was deciding about. I shot it through the shoulder. It dropped, dragged itself a body length, and lay there breathing in a wet, ragged way until I walked up close and finished it. And then there was just the wind and the man on the ground making a sound that wasn't screaming anymore, just a low, steady pull of air through his teeth. He was maybe 40, hard to say with a passion harder still in the dark. He had a cloth band across his forehead soaked black with what I took for sweat and turned out to be blood from a gash above his ear, and his left calf was open to the muscle. And when I knelt down beside him, he reached out, not to me, past me, and put his hand flat on the dead wolf's flank. Just held it there. I didn't understand that then. I think I understand it now. There's a kind of respect you can only pay a thing that nearly killed you. Then he looked at me and said something in Apache, and when I shook my head he tried again in Spanish, which I have a working amount of, and what he said was, "You should have let it finish." I have turned that over for 40 years. You should have let it finish. He was not being dramatic. He meant it as plain information, the way you tell a man he'd left a gate open. There was a weariness in it that I didn't have the wisdom to read at the time. I just thought it was the shock talking. I said in my bad Spanish that he could be ungrateful later, after I'd seen to his leg, and something moved across his face that might have been the ghost of being amused. His name was Tsela. He told me later it meant something to do with stars, though he laughed when he said it, a short laugh with no joy in it, and said his mother had named him Hopping for a calm man and gotten the other kind. I told him my name was Amos Reed, and he repeated it twice, Amos, Amos, tasting it, and decided he didn't care for it and would call me Viejo, old man, which from a man bleeding into the snow I took as fair. I'm getting ahead of myself. That first night I did what you do. I built the fire back up because we'd both die without it, and I cut his trouser leg away and saw that the wolf had laid him open but missed the big vessel, more luck than a man has any right to, and I packed the wound with the cleanest cloth I had, which was a shirt, and bound it tight. He watched me do it without a sound. His hands were curled in the dirt, and his jaw was set so hard I could see the muscle jump, but he didn't make the noise I expected, and there is a thing that happens between two men in a circumstance like that, a thing that has nothing to do with friendship or trust or any of the soft words. It's just two animals recognizing that the other one is enduring something and choosing not to look away. By the time the sky went gray, I had stopped thinking of him as an Apache. I want to be honest that I had been thinking of him as one. I was a man of my time and place, and I'd buried a cousin in the Tonto Basin troubles, and I had the hate in me same as anybody. But you cannot hold a man's leg together through the cold hours and keep all of that. Something leaks out. I don't know a better way to say it. He told me in pieces between the long silences why he'd been up on the bench alone. He was not, he said, supposed to be there. He said the word reservation in English, flat, like a stone he was setting down. He'd been at San Carlos and he'd left, not to fight. He was careful to make me understand that, not to join the ones who'd broken out the year before and gone south into Mexico. But because his sister's boy had died of the coughing sickness in the bad water down there, and Tsela had got it into his head that he had to bury the boy in the high country where the family had always laid its dead, and he'd taken the body and slipped out and carried it 40 miles. And he'd buried it 2 days before the wolves found him on his way back. I asked him why he was going back to San Carlos after all that. He was quiet a long time. The fire popped, and then he said in Spanish, "Because my mother is there and my sister, and if I do not return they will say I ran and the soldiers will make it harder for everyone." He looked at me. You understand, a man cannot only think of himself. There are people who answer for what I do. I wrote that down too the next morning. I wrote, he went back into the cage because of who would suffer if he didn't. I have known white men decorated as heroes who never made a choice that hard. We could not move that first day. His leg wouldn't take weight, and I wasn't fool enough to think I could get him up onto my horse over the rocks in the state he was in. So we waited, and I shot a rabbit and we ate it, and I learned that he was funnier than I'd have credited, dry as a creek bed in July. When I burned the rabbit, he watched me curse at it and said, mild as milk, that the wolves had clearly come for the better cook and gotten the wrong man. I laughed. God help me. I laughed out there in that cold place with 2 corpses of wolves stiffening 20 feet away, and a man bleeding through my best shirt. and it felt like something cracking open in my chest that had been sealed since Sarah died. That's the part nobody who tells these stories ever gets right. They make it solemn. It wasn't all solemn. We laughed. A great deal of what makes a man worth knowing comes out in how he jokes when things are bad, and Tsela joked the way some men pray. The second day his fever came up. I knew enough to be afraid of it. A wound like that in country like that, the fever is the thing that kills you, not the bite. By midday he was talking to people who weren't there, in Apache, soft and urgent, reaching for hands in the air, and I sat there useless with my journal in my lap, not writing anything because there was nothing in me to write. I had a little laudanum in my kit and I gave him some, and it brought the fever down enough that by evening he knew me again, and he caught my wrist with a grip surprisingly strong for a sick man and said in Spanish, very clearly, "If I die, do not leave me for them. Cover me with stones. Promise." Them meant the wolves. I understood that much, I promised. But he didn't die. The fever broke in the night and he came back to himself, wrung out and gray and alive. And on the morning of the third day, he could sit a horse if I let it slow. And I made a decision that I have spent the rest of my life turning over the way you turn over a stone you suspected of hiding something. I did not take him back toward San Carlos. It was 60 miles and his leg would have rotted before we got there. I took him to my place. I had a ranch on the Chenega, a low spread of adobe and a good well and 40 head, and not another soul on it since I'd let my hand go the previous fall because I couldn't pay him. It was 4 hours' ride. And the whole 4 hours, leading that horse with the wounded Apache swaying on its back, I knew, I want this on the record, I knew what it would mean if anyone saw. I knew what the men in Chenega town thought about Apache off the reservation. I knew there were 3 families within a day's ride who'd lost people in the Troubles, and would no more distinguish between a man burying his nephew and a man burning a homestead than they'd distinguish between one gray wolf and another. I took him anyway, and I think the reason I took him is the same reason I went toward the screaming. I was a lonely old man who'd heard something human in the dark and couldn't make himself walk away from it. We came down into my draw a little before dark. The cottonwoods were just going to leaf, and there was a green smell coming up off the creek, and my dog came out to meet us and stopped dead when it scented Tsela, and stood there with its hackles up, growling low, and I told it to hush, and it hushed, but it watched him the whole way to the door. I got him inside. I got him onto Sarah's old bed, the one I hadn't slept in since, and I cleaned the wound again in good light for the first time and saw it was angry but not dying, and I fed him broth, and he slept. And I sat at my own table in my own house with a rifle across my knees, not because I was afraid of him. I'd stopped being afraid of him somewhere up on the bench, but because some animal part of me had already understood, before my mind would say it, that the danger was never going to come from the man in the bed. It was going to come from my own people. I wrote one line in my journal that night, and then I put the pen down because my hand wouldn't make the next one. I wrote, "I have brought something home that I cannot now set down." The lamp guttered. Outside, far off, a coyote called and another answered, and Tsela stirred in his sleep and said a name I didn't know, soft, the way you say a name you don't expect to answer. The first 4 days at the ranch were the best 4 days I had lived since my wife went into the ground, and I knew it even while they were happening, which is a rare and terrible kind of knowing. Tsela's strength came back faster than I'd have believed. By the second day he could cross the room hand over hand along the wall, cursing his leg in 2 languages, and by the 4th he was sitting out front on the bench in the morning sun with my dog, who had decided, in the abrupt and total way of dogs, that he was now beloved, laying its fool head in his lap. He whittled. He found a piece of cottonwood and a knife I gave him, and he sat there in the sun making a small thing take shape, and when I asked what it was he said, "A horse, for a boy," and didn't say which boy, and I didn't ask, because I had worked out by then that the boy was the one under the stones in the high country, and that Tsela was making a toy for a child who would never hold it. I have thought about that more than almost anything. A man whittling a horse for a dead child, not because the child could use it, because the making of it was a way of staying near him a little longer. There is a grief that has nowhere to go, and so it goes into your hands. We talked. Lord, how we talked, in our cobbled-together Spanish with English and Apache jammed into the gaps. He asked me about Sarah, and I told him things I hadn't told the living. How she died of a thing in her belly that the doctor in Tucson couldn't name. How I'd held her at the end and felt her go, and how the worst of it wasn't the dying but the 4 years after. The long, flat country of after, where every morning you wake up and have to remember all over again. He listened the way few men listen, without rushing to lay his own grief on top of mine. And when I was done, he was quiet, and then he said, "My wife also," and that was all, and it was enough. And we sat there, two widowers in the sun, not needing to say the rest. He told me about the reservation. I'd had notions. The notions were children's drawings next to the thing he described. He talked about the water that came up out of the ground tasting of metal and made the children sick, the agent who sold the cattle that were meant for the people and pocketed the silver, the way a man who had been a leader of men was made to stand in a line for flour like a beggar, the slow grinding theft not of land only but of the thing inside a man that lets him stand up straight. He didn't say it bitter. That was what undid me. He said it the way you'd describe weather. He'd lived inside it so long the outrage had worn smooth. "Why don't you run?" I asked him. "South like the others." He looked at the horse taking shape under his knife. "Some men are made to run and fight," he said. "I was, once." He turned the wood. "But every time the young men run, the soldiers come, and it is the old ones and the children who pay. So," he shrugged, and it was the saddest shrug I ever saw. "I learned to be a different kind of man than I was born. It is harder than fighting. No one sings about it. No one sings about it." I wrote that one down with my hand steady for once, because I wanted to get it exact. I should have known it couldn't hold. On the 5th day, Del Hartigan rode up my draw. Del ran cattle on the far side of the ridge, and we'd been neighbors 15 years, and I'd have called him a friend. The way you call a man a friend when you've branded calves together and buried each other's people and never once had a conversation that went deeper than weather and grass. He came up easy, lifting a hand, calling out, and I went out to meet him fast, too fast, and he marked it, and I tried to keep him in the yard away from the house, but Del had a nose for a wrong thing the way a buzzard does, and he sat his horse looking past me at the bench by the door where a half-whittled wooden horse lay in a curl of pale shavings, and at my dog, who had trotted out to greet him and then turned and trotted right back toward the dark of the open door. Toward the man Del could not yet see but was beginning. I watched it happen on his face to suspect. "Amos," he said slowly, "what have you got in your house?" I could have lied. I have asked myself 10,000 times why I didn't lie. I think it was pride. I think after 5 days of sitting with a man who'd learned to swallow every insult to keep his people safe, I had got some foolish notion in my head that a man ought to be able to tell the truth in his own yard. I said, "A hurt man. Wolves got him up on the bench. I brought him in." "A hurt man?" Del's eyes hadn't left the door. "Hurt men don't whittle Apache horses, Amos." So he'd seen the horse for what it was. I should have known. Del had lost a brother in '72. What I remember most is how quiet he got. Del was a loud man, a backslapper, a teller of long stories, and he went quiet, and that quiet was the most frightening thing I'd encountered since the wolves, worse than the wolves because a wolf only wants to eat. Del turned his horse and he said, not looking at me, "You always were soft, Amos. Sarah used to say it like it was sweet." He gathered his reins. I got to think on this. "Del," I went after his stirrup. "He buried a child. That's all he done. He buried his sister's boy in the high ground, and he's going back to San Carlos soon as he can walk, going back, you hear, back into it because his people'll answer for him if he don't. There's no harm in him." Del looked down at me for a long moment, and I'll give him this. There was something in his face that was almost sorrow. "There was no harm in my brother neither," he said. "Didn't keep him alive." And he rode out of my draw, and I stood there in the dust knowing I had perhaps 4 hours, perhaps less, before he reached town and told it, and that once it was told it could not be untold. I went back inside. Tsela was sitting up. He'd heard it all, or enough of it, and he had that stillness on him that I'd come to know meant he was thinking hard and fast underneath a face like a cliff. "You should not have told him," he said. "No anger, just the open gate tone. I know it. He will bring men. I know that too." Tsela looked at the wall a while. Then he said, "Help me to the horse, I will go now. In the dark I can," and he tried to stand and his leg buckled and he went down hard against the bed frame and sat there breathing through his teeth, and he saw that he could not ride. Not yet. Not far enough or fast enough. 20 miles maybe slow, and they'd run him down inside 10. We sat in the failing light, the two of us, with that fact between us like a third man in the room. Here is the morally heavy thing, and I'm going to set it down plain because I have hidden from it long enough. I had a choice, and I knew all its parts. I could put him on a horse and send him off into the dark to be run down and killed somewhere out of my sight, and then meet the men in my yard with my hands empty and my conscience telling itself a story about how I'd done what I could. That was the easy road. No one would ever have known I'd done less than my best. Tsela would have urged me to it himself. He'd have called it sense. Or I could keep him, stand between him and them. And I knew what that meant. I wanted understood that I knew, because in that country a white man who stood with an Apache against other white men did not get to go home after and resume being a rancher and a neighbor. He became a thing apart. A squaw man, they'd say, or worse. They might not hang me. But the life I'd had, the brandings, the burials, the long, flat, bearable country of after, that life was over the moment I planted my feet. And at 58 years old, a man knows exactly how much a life is worth, and how little is left of it, and how heavy the loneliness already is without adding the whole town's back turned to it. I sat there. The wooden horse lay on the bench outside in the dark, unfinished, 4 legs and no head yet, a gift for a child in the ground. And Tsela, watching my face, understood the whole of it. He understood it better than I did. And he said something then that I have never told another living soul, and that I am only telling you because the lamp is nearly out, and I am nearly out, and somebody ought to know what kind of man he was. He said, "Viejo, listen to me, you have a life here. I have a leg that does not work and a place waiting for me that is already a kind of death." He leaned forward. "Do not trade a true thing for a man you have known 5 days. Put me on the horse. If I die in the dark, I die in the dark a free man, and that is more than San Carlos was ever going to give me. Let me give you something. Let me leave so that you do not have to choose." He was offering to die, to spare me the cost of saving him. That was the kind of man the men from town were coming to kill. I did not say anything for a long time. Outside, the first stars were coming out. Tsela, I thought, Stars his name, and my dog was packing by the door, and somewhere up on the bench the wolf's bones were going gray under the moon. Then I got up, and I barred the door, and I took my rifle down off the wall, and I sat down in the chair facing it. "You burned the rabbit," I said. "I'm not letting you ruin this too." He stared at me, and then he laughed that short laugh, but this time, for the first time, there was something in it that wasn't grief. We didn't sleep. We sat up the whole night, the two of us, listening to the dark for the sound of horses, and a little before dawn we heard them. They came in the gray hour, the way men always come when they mean a thing they're ashamed of, early, so as to be done before the full light made them look at it. I heard them while they were still up the draw, more by the way my dog went rigid than by any sound, and then the sound came, the soft multiple thud of shod horses on dirt, slow, fanning out the way men do when they've talked it over on the ride and decided on a plan. I counted by the hoofbeats. 5, maybe 6. In a town the size of Shenega that was most of the men who could ride and shoot, which told me Dell hadn't had to work hard to raise them. The hate was already there. It always is. It just waits for a door to walk through. I'd had all night to be afraid, and I'd used it up. By dawn, I was past fear, and into a kind of cold, clear stillness I have only felt a handful of times in my life, all of them moments when there was no longer any decision left to make, only a thing to do. I told Tsela to stay back from the window. He had my pistol. I'd given it to him in the dark without either of us saying anything about what it meant for a white man to arm an Apache while a posse rode in. And he dragged himself to the corner where he had a line on the door and the wall at his back. And he looked at me across the room, and I looked at him, and there was nothing left to say that we hadn't said, so we didn't say anything. He nodded. I nodded. I opened my own door and stepped out into my yard with my rifle held low and easy and not pointed at anyone, which is its own kind of language men understand. They'd stopped about 40 feet out, strung in a loose line. Dell in the middle. I knew every man of them. There was Press Cobb, who I'd pulled out of a flooded wash in '79, and the Yancey brothers who'd eaten at my table, and old Tom Ruiz, who was half Mexican himself and ought to have known better, and whose face was the only one that wouldn't meet my eyes. They had their rifles out but not up. Dell had a rope coiled on his saddle, and I looked at it and looked at him, and he had the grace, at least, to color a little. "Step aside, Amos," Dell said. "We don't want trouble with you. Hand him out and we'll forget you had any part in it." "He buried a child," I said. My voice came out steadier than I'd hoped. "He's going back to the reservation soon as he can ride. He's harmed no one, Dell, not one soul. You know it, or you'd not have come at dawn." "He's off San Carlos without leave," said Press Cobb, "and that's the law, and the law says." "The law?" I almost laughed. "Since when did this outfit ride for the law, Press? The law's in Tucson. You came up here in the dark to do a murder and call it something else, and every man here knows it, and you'll all ride home and eat your breakfast, and not one of you will say the word out loud for the rest of your lives." That landed. I saw it land. Men can do a terrible thing in a crowd that not one of them could do alone, but you can sometimes, if you're quick and you mean it, make them feel the eyes of the others, make each man afraid of being the one who did it. Tom Ruiz turned his horse a half step out of the line, just a half step, but I saw it. Dell saw it too, and Dell was no fool, and he did the thing that fools never do and dangerous men always do. He made it personal, and he made it fast, before the others could think. "My brother," he said, "was 23 years old, and they left him in pieces a man couldn't gather in a blanket, and you want me to ride home because this one says he buried a child." His voice cracked on it. That was the worst part. The grief in it was real. "You're asking me to choose him over Will." And there it was, the thing under all of it. Not law, not even hate exactly, grief, old grief gone hard and poisonous for want of anywhere to put it. The exact same grief I'd watched Tsela pour into a wooden horse, except Dell had never learned to whittle. Dell had only ever learned to load. I didn't have an answer to that. There isn't one. You cannot argue a man out of his dead. So I didn't argue. "I'm not asking you to choose him over Will." I said, "I'm asking you not to make another woman bury her brother in pieces so you can feel for one morning like you got even. It won't bring Will back, Dell. You know it won't. You've had 12 years to find out it won't." The yard went very quiet. The light was coming up pink over the ridge now, full dawn, the thing they'd ridden early to beat, and it lit all their faces and made them look at each other, which was the one thing I'd been praying for. And it might have held. I believe to this day it might have held, that they might have turned their horses and rode out of my draw and let the thing go, if Tsela had stayed in the corner where I'd put him. But he didn't. The door opened behind me. I heard it and my heart dropped because I knew what it meant, and I turned to see him come out, dragging the bad leg, one hand on the door frame, and he had set down the pistol inside. He came out unarmed. He came out into the open, into the rifles, with his hands empty and open at his sides, and he stood beside me, not behind me, beside me, and he looked at Dell Hartigan and he said in Spanish, slow, so it could be understood, "You, the one whose brother died, look at me." He waited until Dell looked. I have buried a brother and a wife, and 8 days ago a child of 9 years who was the last of my sister's blood in ground I will be killed for visiting. I know what is in you. It is in me also. He drew a breath. If you must kill someone this morning to carry it, kill me. I am tired and my leg is ruined and I was going back to a slow death anyway. But you will not do it on this man's land and you will not make him pay for it after. He found me dying and he was the only one in your whole country who treated me as a man. Do not repay that by making him an outcast among you. Take me out past his line. Do it there. Leave him clean. He started walking toward them, toward the rifles, dragging the leg, leaving a furrow in the dust, walking out past the edge of my yard so that whatever happened would not happen on my ground. I have seen brave things. I saw men go up the slope at Apache Pass. This was not like that. This was a man who had spent years teaching himself to be smaller so that others could live, performing the last and largest version of that, walking unarmed toward 6 guns so that the only friend he had left could keep his neighbors. And nobody fired. That's the part I can't ever make anyone believe. Nobody fired. He walked right up to Dell Hardigan's horse and stood there looking up at him, empty-handed, and Dell looked down at him. And the two of them, the 2 grieving men, held there a long moment in the pink light. And then Dell Hardigan made a sound I have never forgotten, a kind of broken exhale, and he turned his horse's head and rode away. Just rode. Didn't say a word. And the others, after a frozen moment, went after him, all but Tom Ruiz, who sat his horse a second longer and then took off his hat to Tsela, took off his hat and followed. I stood in my yard and watched the dust of them go down the draw, and I was shaking so hard I had to put the rifle butt on the ground and lean on it. Tsela came back across the line, dragging the leg, and he was shaking too, and when he reached me neither of us could speak, and so we did the only thing there was to do, which was to stand there in my yard in the new light and hold onto each other's forearms like 2 men keeping each other from falling, which is what we were. He left 4 days later. He could ride by then, just barely, and we both knew Dell's mercy was a thing that might not survive a second sunrise of thinking, and that the kindest thing the world was going to offer either of us was a clean goodbye. I gave him my second-best horse and what food I could spare and a coat that had been Sarah's father's. He gave me the wooden horse. He'd finished it those last 4 days, given it a head, and a mane scored in with the knife point, and he set it in my hand and closed my fingers over it and said, "For your boy." I told him I had no boy. He said, "You will tell someone this story, give it to them." And I have carried it 40 years and I am giving it now to whoever you are, reading this. And the wooden horse is on the table beside the lamp as I write, worn smooth in places from my thumb. He rode out at first light, north toward San Carlos, toward the cage he was going back to so his mother and his sister would not pay for his freedom. I watched him to the top of the draw. At the top he stopped and turned the horse and lifted one hand, not waving, just holding it up, the way he'd held his palm on the dead wolf's flank that first night, that gesture that meant I see you, and I will not look away, and then he was over the rise and gone. I never saw him again. I asked over the years in the careful sideways way you had to ask such things. I heard, maybe 4 years on, that there'd been a Tsela at San Carlos who died of the lung sickness in the winter, but the man who told me wasn't sure of the name, and I have chosen, on the whole, not to be sure of it either. There's a mercy in not being sure. Dell Hardigan and I never spoke of that morning. We went on being neighbors in the thin way we always had, branded calves together, and when he died I went to the burying and stood at the back and was, I think, the only man there who knew the largest thing he'd ever done was the killing he didn't do in my yard in the pink light, 12 years too late to save his brother, but not, as it turned out, too late to save his soul a little. I never told anyone that either. He'd not have thanked me. The lamp is going now. I knew it would last about this long. My hand has held up better than I feared. I keep coming back to what he said that first night, with the wolf's blood freezing in the snow. You should have let it finish. I thought he was talking about the wolves. I've come to think he meant something larger, that he'd already made his peace with an ending, and I'd dragged him back from it. And the 9 days I gave him were 9 days of being a man again before he went back into being less than one. I don't know if that was a kindness. I have never known. But I know that for 9 days, two grieving men who were never supposed to so much as speak to each other sat in the sun, and told the truth and laughed at a burned rabbit, and one of them whittled a horse, and one of them learned that the danger in this world has almost never been the thing with teeth out in the dark. It's the people who look just like you, writing up your own draw in the gray hour, certain they are right.